The weight of tomorrow. Matthew 11 verses 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Chapter 1. The Daily Grind. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Thompson navigated the bustling corridors of St. Jude's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. The familiar scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint aroma of coffee from the break room, creating a backdrop that felt both comforting and suffocating. It was a typical Tuesday, and the chaos of the emergency room was in full swing. "Sarah, can you take room 3? We're swamped," called out Mark, one of her fellow nurses, as he rushed past her with a stack of charts. "On it," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. She had always thrived in high-pressure situations, finding purpose in the frantic pace of hospital life. But lately, the weight of responsibility felt heavier, pressing down on her shoulders like an unwelcome burden. Entering room 3, she was greeted by the sight of a frail, elderly man lying on the bed, his face etched with pain. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," she said with a warm smile that masked her fatigue. "How are we feeling today?" "Like I've been run over by a truck," he replied with a weak chuckle. "But I suppose that's just part of getting old." Sarah chuckled softly, adjusting his foreline and checking his vitals. "Well, let's see if we can get you feeling a bit better today." As she worked, she engaged him in light conversation about his favorite baseball team, trying to distract him from his discomfort. Throughout the day, Sarah moved from patient to patient, each encounter a reminder of why she had chosen this path. She loved being a nurse. It was her calling. Yet, as she glanced at the clock and realized how quickly time slipped away, a familiar pang of exhaustion settled in her chest. During her brief break in the staff lounge, Sarah sank into a chair and closed her eyes for a moment. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air around her, but she felt distant from it all. Her colleagues shared stories about their weekends and upcoming plans while she sipped her lukewarm coffee, feeling increasingly isolated. "Hey Sarah, you coming to trivia night this Friday?" Mia, her best friend and fellow nurse, asked as she plopped down beside her. "Maybe," Sarah replied noncommittally, avoiding Mia's gaze. The thought of socializing felt overwhelming. She couldn't remember the last time she had truly enjoyed herself outside of work. "Come on. It'll be fun." "You need to unwind," Mia urged with an encouraging smile. "You've been working non-stop lately." "I know," Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "I just have so much on my plate right now." Mia frowned slightly but nodded in understanding. "Just remember to take care of yourself, too." With that, Mia stood up and rejoined the group, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. As the day wore on and night fell over Portland, Sarah found herself back in the emergency room. The pace quickened as more patients arrived, accidents from the rain-soaked streets and illnesses that had festered during the week. Each new case added to her mental checklist: medications to administer, charts to update, families to reassure. By midnight, fatigue clung to Sarah like a heavy cloak. She glanced at Mrs. Jenkins' room, her favorite patient, who had been battling cancer for months, but still managed to share stories that brought warmth into their sterile surroundings. "Hey there," Sarah said softly as she entered Mrs. Jenkins' room. My favorite nurse." Mrs. Jenkins beamed from her bed. "How are you holding up?" "I'm good," Sarah lied easily as she checked Mrs. Jenkins' vitals. "Just busy as usual." Mrs. Jenkins studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You know, dear, it's okay to feel overwhelmed sometimes." Her voice was gentle yet firm. "I appreciate that," Sarah replied with a small smile, but quickly changed the subject back to Mrs. Jenkins' treatment plan. As she wrapped up for the night and prepared to head home through the rain-soaked streets of Portland, Sarah couldn't shake off an unsettling feeling deep within her, a sense that something was amiss beneath her practiced facade of strength and resilience. She stepped into her apartment and closed the door behind her with a sigh. The silence enveloped her like an old friend. It was comforting yet lonely all at once. She tossed her bag onto the couch and stared out at the rain streaking down the window. In that moment of solitude, Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to cry but held it back instead, a habit she'd perfected over years of nursing where vulnerability seemed like a luxury she could not afford. Tomorrow would be another busy day at St. Jude's Hospital, another chance to make a difference. But tonight she couldn't shake off the feeling that something needed to change before it was too late. Chapter 2. A Heavy Heart. The following morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical for Portland in the fall. Sarah awoke to the sound of rain tapping against her window, a steady rhythm that matched the unease swirling in her chest. She dragged herself out of bed, forcing herself to prepare for another long shift at St. Jude's. As she arrived at the hospital, the familiar sights and sounds enveloped her. Nurses bustled about, doctors exchanged quick greetings, and the scent of coffee wafted through the air. Yet, a sense of heaviness settled over Sarah as she made her way to the break room for a quick cup before starting her rounds. "Hey, Sarah," Mark called out as she entered. "You ready for another wild day?" "Always," she replied with a forced smile, trying to mask her growing anxiety. The morning passed in a blur of activity, but Sarah felt disconnected from it all. She moved through her tasks mechanically, checking on patients and administering medications while her mind wandered back to Mrs. Jenkins. The elderly woman had become a beacon of light for Sarah amid the chaos of the hospital. Their conversations often lifted Sarah's spirits. When lunchtime rolled around, Sarah found herself drawn to Mrs. Jenkins' room again. She knocked softly before entering, hoping to find her friend in good spirits. "Good afternoon, dear." Mrs. Jenkins greeted her with a bright smile that lit up her frail face. "I was just thinking about you." "Really? What were you thinking?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I was wondering if you'd bring me some of that delicious soup they serve in the cafeteria." Mrs. Jenkins chuckled softly. "You know how I love it." Sarah laughed lightly, grateful for the momentary distraction from her own worries. "I'll see what I can do." As they chatted about trivial things, Mrs. Jenkins' favorite television shows and family stories, Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her heart. But as she glanced at Mrs. Jenkins' pale complexion, a pang of dread washed over her. Later that afternoon, Sarah was called into a meeting with Dr. Patel, the head of oncology. The atmosphere in the room was somber as he shared updates on Mrs. Jenkins' condition. "Sarah," Dr. Patel began gently, "I need to discuss Mrs. Jenkins with you." Her heart sank as she listened to Dr. Patel explain that despite their best efforts, Mrs. Jenkins' cancer had progressed significantly. The prognosis was grim. She might only have weeks left. "Are you sure?" Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, disbelief flooding her mind. "I'm afraid so," Dr. Patel replied softly, his eyes filled with compassion. "She's a fighter, but we need to prepare for what's coming." Numbness washed over Sarah as she left the meeting and returned to Mrs. Jenkins' room. She fought back tears as she entered. She had always been strong for her patients, but this felt different, personal. "Hey there," Mrs. Jenkins said brightly as if nothing were wrong. "Hi," Sarah managed, forcing a smile that felt like a mask over her true emotions. "Did you bring my soup?" Mrs. Jenkins asked playfully. "I'm sorry. I got caught up in meetings," Sarah replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Jenkins studied her closely, sensing something was off. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Sarah lied again, but the words tasted bitter on her tongue. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, reaching for Sarah's hand with surprising strength despite her frail appearance. "You don't have to pretend with me." Tears threatened to spill from Sarah's eyes as she squeezed Mrs. Jenkins' hand tightly. "I just want you to be okay." "I know you do," Mrs. Jenkins said gently, squeezing back with warmth and understanding that seemed to transcend their circumstances. As they sat together in silence for a moment, Sarah felt an overwhelming wave of emotion crash over her, a mixture of grief and fear for what lay ahead not just for Mrs. Jenkins but for herself too. That evening after work, Sarah returned home feeling hollow and drained. The rain continued its relentless patter against the window as she sat on her couch staring blankly at the wall. She picked up her phone and scrolled through messages from Mia inviting her out for dinner or trivia night, each one reminding her of how disconnected she felt from everyone around her. With a heavy heart and an even heavier mind, Sarah picked up an old journal from her bookshelf, a collection of thoughts and dreams written during college when everything seemed possible and bright. Flipping through its pages brought back memories of hope and ambition, the dreams she once had about making a difference in people's lives without losing herself in the process. But now it felt like those dreams were slipping away like water through her fingers. As she closed the journal and set it aside with a sigh, Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling that something had to change before it was too late, not just for Mrs. Jenkins, but for herself too. Tomorrow would bring more challenges at St. Jude's Hospital, a new day filled with patients who needed care, but deep down inside, she knew that if she didn't find a way to share this burden soon, it might become too much to bear alone. Chapter 3: Isolation. The next morning, the rain had finally subsided, leaving behind a fresh, crisp air that filled the streets of Portland. But as Sarah stepped outside, the cool breeze did little to lift the heaviness in her heart. She arrived at St. Jude's Hospital with a sense of dread that clung to her like a shadow. "Morning, Sarah." Mark greeted her as he passed by, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to her mood. "Morning," she replied absently, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. As she made her way to the nurse's station, she could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. The morning shift began like any other. Patients needed care, charts needed updating, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Yet Sarah felt increasingly detached from it all. She moved through her tasks like a ghost, attending to patients but not truly engaging with them. "Hey Sarah, you okay?" Mia asked during their brief break in the staff lounge. She had noticed Sarah's distant demeanor and leaned in closer, concern etched on her face. "Yeah, I'm fine," Sarah replied too quickly, avoiding Mia's gaze as she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. Mia narrowed her eyes. "You don't look fine. You look worn out. You've been working non-stop for weeks." "I'm just busy," Sarah said defensively, feeling irritation bubble beneath her surface. "It's part of the job. It's one thing to be busy. It's another to burn yourself out," Mia pressed gently. "You need to take care of yourself too." "I know," Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples as if trying to massage away the tension. "I just have so much on my plate right now." Mia opened her mouth to respond but then hesitated, sensing that pushing further might only drive Sarah away. "Okay, but remember I'm here if you need anything," she said softly before returning to the others. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself retreating further into herself. She avoided social interactions and declined invitations for lunch or coffee breaks with colleagues. Each time someone reached out, she brushed them off with excuses or vague responses. By the end of her shift, she was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally drained from pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. That evening, Sarah returned home and collapsed onto her couch. The silence of her apartment felt suffocating. It was a stark reminder of how alone she had become. She scrolled through social media on her phone, seeing pictures of friends enjoying life, laughing at trivia nights and sharing meals together, while she sat in isolation. A notification popped up from Mia. "Hey, we missed you at trivia night. Let's get together soon." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing a quick response. "Thanks. I'll try to make it next time." But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She was too tired to engage and too ashamed to admit how much she needed help. As days turned into weeks, Sarah continued this cycle of isolation. The hospital became both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she could pour herself into work, but also where the weight of responsibility felt crushingly heavy without relief. One afternoon during her shift, Sarah found herself back in Mrs. Jenkins' room. The elderly woman was sitting up in bed, looking frilier than ever, but still managing a warm smile. "Hello again, dear." Mrs. Jenkins greeted with genuine warmth that momentarily lifted Sarah's spirits. "Hi, Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah replied softly as she checked the four-line and adjusted pillows for comfort. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," Mrs. Jenkins observed keenly. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted automatically, but felt a pang of guilt at lying to someone who had always been honest with her. Mrs. Jenkins studied her for a moment longer before speaking again. "You know it's okay to ask for help when you need it." Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over as she looked into Mrs. Jenkins' wise eyes, eyes that had seen so much yet still held kindness and understanding. I don't want to burden anyone else," Sarah admitted quietly. "You're not a burden," Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. "We all need each other in this life, especially in times of trouble." As they talked about lighter topics for a while, favorite movies and family memories, Sarah felt herself relax slightly under Mrs. Jenkins' gentle encouragement. But as their conversation shifted back toward health updates and treatment plans, the reality of their situation loomed over them like dark clouds gathering on the horizon. When it was time for Sarah to leave for the day, she felt an ache in her heart as Mrs. Jenkins reached out and grasped her hand tightly. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself too," Mrs. Jenkins said earnestly. "I promise," Sarah replied automatically, but knew deep down that she wasn't keeping that promise. Not really. As she walked out into the cool evening air after another long shift filled with emotional turmoil and isolation, Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling that something had to change before it was too late, not just for Mrs. Jenkins but for herself too. But how? The question echoed in her mind as she made her way home through the dimly lit streets of Portland, a city bustling with life while she felt increasingly invisible within it. Chapter 4: Breaking Point. The following day dawned with a heavy fog that clung to the streets of Portland like a shroud, mirroring Sarah's mental state. She trudged through her morning routine, each task feeling like an insurmountable obstacle. The weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her, and the familiar hum of the hospital felt more like a cacophony of demands than a symphony of care. As she clocked in for her shift at St. Jude's, Sarah felt a sense of dread wash over her. The emergency room was already buzzing with activity, and she could sense the urgency in the air. Nurses rushed past her, their faces etched with determination, while doctors barked orders to one another. It was a whirlwind she had once thrived in, but today it felt like a storm she could barely weather. "Sarah, we need you in trauma," Mark shouted as he rushed by, barely pausing to acknowledge her. "On my way," she called back, forcing herself to move forward despite the heaviness in her chest. She entered the trauma bay, where chaos reigned. A young man lay on a stretcher, blood seeping through his shirt from a deep laceration on his side. The team worked swiftly, and Sarah joined them, focusing on the task at hand. But as she assisted with the procedures, applying pressure to the wound and monitoring vital signs, her mind began to drift. Thoughts of Mrs. Jenkins flooded her consciousness, and she couldn't shake off the image of her frail body and fading spirit. The juxtaposition of life and death felt overwhelming as she fought to keep herself grounded. Hours passed in a blur of adrenaline and urgency. Sarah moved from patient to patient, but with each new case, she felt more detached from reality. She was there physically but emotionally miles away, trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and exhaustion. By lunchtime, Sarah's head throbbed painfully, and her stomach twisted with anxiety. She stepped into the break room for a moment of respite, but found it crowded with colleagues laughing and sharing stories over their meals. The sound felt jarring against her growing sense of isolation. "Hey, you made it," Mia exclaimed as she spotted Sarah standing awkwardly by the door. "Just for a minute," Sarah replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come join us. We're just talking about our plans for Halloween," Mia urged, gesturing toward an empty seat. "I really can't," Sarah insisted, shaking her head. "I need to check on my patients." Mia's expression shifted from enthusiasm to concern. "You've been working nonstop, Sarah. You need to take a break." "I'm fine," Sarah snapped before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air like an accusation against herself. Mia looked taken aback but quickly recovered. "I'm just worried about you." "I appreciate it," Sarah said curtly before turning away from the group and leaving the break room behind. As she walked through the hospital corridors, frustration bubbled within her, a mix of anger at herself for pushing people away and at others for not understanding how much she had to carry alone. With each step toward Mrs. Jenkins' room, that frustration morphed into an overwhelming sense of despair. When she finally reached Mrs. Jenkins' room, she paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself before entering. But as soon as she stepped inside and saw Mrs. Jenkins lying there, pale and fragile, the dam broke. "Sarah, there you are." Mrs. Jenkins smiled brightly despite her condition. But instead of responding with warmth, tears streamed down Sarah's face unbidden as she sank into the chair beside the bed. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed, feeling raw and exposed. Mrs. Jenkins' smile faltered as concern filled her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I'm so tired," Sarah admitted between sobs. "I feel like I'm drowning at work, and I can't keep pretending I'm okay when I'm not." Mrs. Jenkins reached out weakly and took Sarah's hand in hers, offering comfort despite her own frailty. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, she said gently. You're human. But I'm supposed to be strong for you. Sarah cried out in frustration. You can be strong by allowing yourself to feel, Mrs. Jenkins replied softly but firmly. Strength isn't just about carrying burdens, it's also about sharing them. As they sat together in silence for a moment, Sarah felt an ache in her heart, a longing for connection that had been missing for too long. She realized how much she needed someone to lean on but had pushed everyone away instead. Suddenly, an alarm blared from outside the room, a frantic sound that jolted both women back into reality. I have to go, Sarah said reluctantly as she wiped her tears away hastily. Promise me you'll talk to someone, Mrs. Jenkins urged as Sarah stood up. I will, Sarah lied again, knowing deep down that she wasn't ready yet. As she rushed back into the whirlwind of hospital life, attending to patients and managing crises, Sarah felt like a puppet on strings pulled taut by expectations and responsibilities that were becoming increasingly unbearable. By the end of her shift that night, exhaustion washed over her like a tidal wave. Every muscle in her body screamed for relief as she clocked out and stepped outside into the cool night air. But instead of feeling refreshed by the crisp breeze or comforted by the familiar sounds of Portland nightlife, all Sarah felt was emptiness, a hollow ache that echoed inside her chest. That night as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling above her, a million thoughts racing through her mind, she finally acknowledged what had been building inside. She was at breaking point. Something had to give before it was too late, not just for Mrs. Jenkins or for anyone else, but for herself too. Chapter 5: The Fall. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden hue over Portland. But for Sarah, the light felt distant, almost mocking. She dragged herself out of bed, her body heavy with fatigue and her mind clouded with worry. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind like a broken record, and she couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. As she arrived at St. Jude's Hospital, the familiar sights and sounds felt muted. Nurses bustled about, doctors barked orders, and patients called for assistance. But Sarah moved through it all like a ghost, present yet completely detached. She forced herself to check in with her patients, but her heart wasn't in it. Sarah, we need you in room 6. Mark called out as he passed her in the hallway. On my way, she replied automatically, though her feet felt like they were stuck in quicksand. Room 6 was occupied by a middle-aged woman suffering from severe abdominal pain. As Sarah assessed her condition and prepared to administer medication, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from her mind. Are you okay? The patient asked, concern etched on her face. Yeah, just a little tired, Sarah managed to say, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But as she continued to work, the dizziness intensified. The room began to spin slightly, and she gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. I'll be right back, she said abruptly before stepping out into the hallway. The bustling sounds of the hospital faded into a dull roar as she leaned against the wall for support. Her heart raced as panic set in. She had never felt this way before. Taking deep breaths, she tried to calm herself down but found it increasingly difficult. Sarah? Mia's voice broke through the haze as she approached. What's going on? You look pale. I'm fine, Sarah insisted again, but her voice wavered. Mia narrowed her eyes in disbelief. You're not fine. You need to sit down. Before Sarah could respond, darkness began to creep into her vision. The last thing she remembered was Mia's worried expression before everything went black. When Sarah came to, she found herself lying on a gurney in a small exam room. The bright lights above hurt her eyes as she blinked against them. Panic surged through her as she tried to sit up. Easy there, a nurse said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder to keep her down. You fainted. I'm fine, Sarah protested weakly, but the nurse shook her head. You're not fine. You've been pushing yourself too hard, the nurse replied firmly but kindly. Mia appeared at the doorway, relief flooding her features when she saw that Sarah was awake. Thank goodness. I was so worried about you. What happened? Sarah asked, still feeling disoriented. You collapsed in the hallway, Mia explained softly as she stepped closer. You haven't been taking care of yourself. I'm just tired, Sarah said defensively. No, Mia said firmly. You're overwhelmed and exhausted. emotionally and physically, and it's catching up with you." The nurse nodded in agreement. "You need rest and some time off to recuperate." "But I can't take time off," Sarah exclaimed, panic rising in her chest again at the thought of leaving her patients unattended. "Sarah," Mia said gently but firmly, "you can't help anyone if you don't help yourself first." As Sarah lay there staring at the ceiling tiles above, her mind racing with thoughts of responsibilities left undone and patients needing care, a realization began to dawn on her. She had been so focused on being strong for everyone else that she had neglected herself completely. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah admitted quietly, tears welling up in her eyes as vulnerability washed over her like a wave. Mia reached for Sarah's hand and squeezed it tightly. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "Let us help you." After what felt like an eternity of silence filled with unspoken fears and doubts, Sarah finally nodded slowly, an acknowledgement that perhaps it was time to let go of some control and allow others to support her. The nurse smiled gently at them both before stepping out to give them some privacy while they talked. "I'm scared," Sarah confessed once they were alone again. "What if I can't handle everything? What if I let everyone down?" "You won't let anyone down by taking care of yourself first," Mia reassured her. "You're human. We all have limits." But even as Mia spoke those words of comfort, doubt lingered in Sarah's heart, an echo of years spent pushing through pain without asking for help or admitting weakness. Eventually, after discussing plans for recovery with both Mia and the nurse who returned periodically to check on her vitals, they decided that Sarah would take a few days off work, a decision that felt monumental yet necessary. As she left St. Jude's Hospital later that day, supported by Mia on one side and a sense of relief mixed with anxiety coursing through her veins, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning of a long journey toward healing, not only for herself but also for those around her who cared deeply for her well-being. But for now, rest was not just an option, it was essential, a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters threatening to pull her under if she didn't learn how to swim again soon enough before it was too late. Chapter 6: A Glimmer of Hope. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the window of Sarah's apartment, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to linger in bed, cocooned in the warmth of her blankets. The chaos of the hospital felt like a distant memory, and for a brief moment, she relished the peace. But as she lay there, thoughts of her patients and responsibilities crept back into her mind. Guilt washed over her, threatening to pull her back under. She had taken time off, but what about Mrs. Jenkins? What about the others who depended on her? With a sigh, Sarah pushed herself up and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She glanced at the clock. Late morning already. The world outside was alive with sounds of laughter and chatter from neighbors enjoying their weekend. But here she was, trapped in her own head. After a quick shower, she made herself a simple breakfast, toast and coffee, and sat at her small kitchen table. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed her old journal lying open nearby. It had been months since she had written anything in it, but something about its presence called to her. Curiosity piqued. Sarah picked it up and flipped through the pages filled with dreams and aspirations from years gone by. The words felt foreign yet familiar. They spoke of hope and ambition before life's burdens had dulled her spirit. One entry caught her eye. Asterisk, I want to help people in a way that makes them feel seen and heard. I want to be a light in their darkest moments. Asterisk. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes as she read those words. She had once believed wholeheartedly in her ability to make a difference, but somewhere along the way, that belief had faded under the weight of responsibility and fear. As she continued to read through her reflections, her hopes for becoming a nurse who not only treated patients but also cared for their emotional well-being, a flicker of determination ignited within her. I can't keep doing this alone, she whispered to herself, realizing that perhaps it was time to reach out for support, not just from Mia but from others who understood what it meant to carry such heavy burdens. With renewed resolve, Sarah grabbed her phone and sent a message to Mia. Asterisk, can we meet? I need to talk. Asterisk. Mia responded almost immediately. Asterisk, of course. How about we grab lunch at that little cafe down the street? Asterisk. A wave of relief washed over Sarah as she agreed. It felt good to take this step, to reach out instead of retreating into isolation. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived at the cafe, its warm ambience filled with laughter and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Mia waved from a corner table, her smile brightening the room. "Hey, I'm so glad you came," Mia exclaimed as Sarah settled into the chair across from her. "Thanks for meeting me," Sarah replied, feeling a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "So what's on your mind?" Mia asked gently, leaning forward with genuine interest. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to share everything: the overwhelming feelings of burnout, the guilt about taking time off work, and her fear of letting everyone down. As she spoke, tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they felt different, cathartic rather than suffocating. "I just don't know how to balance it all anymore," Sarah admitted, wiping away a tear. "I thought I could handle everything on my own." "You don't have to do it alone," Mia said softly but firmly. "We're all here for you. It's okay to lean on us." "I know," Sarah replied quietly. "But I've always been the strong one, the one everyone relies on." Mia nodded empathetically. "And that's great. But even strong people need support sometimes. You're human. You're allowed to feel overwhelmed." As they continued their conversation over lunch, sharing stories and laughter, Sarah felt a weight begin to lift off her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was drowning. Instead, she felt buoyed by friendship and understanding. After lunch, they decided to take a walk along the waterfront, a beautiful stretch lined with trees shedding their autumn leaves. The crisp air invigorated Sarah as they strolled side by side. "Have you thought about joining a support group?" Mia suggested as they walked past vendors selling handmade crafts and warm drinks. "I don't know," Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure if I'm ready for that." "It could be really beneficial," Mia encouraged. "There are groups specifically for healthcare workers who understand what you're going through." Sarah considered this idea as they continued walking along the riverbank. The gentle lapping of water against the shore seemed to echo her thoughts, reminding her that change was possible if she allowed herself to embrace it. "Maybe I will," Sarah finally said after a moment of contemplation. "I think I need to talk to people who get it." Mia smiled brightly at this admission. "That's a great step. You're not alone in this. You have so many people who care about you." As they reached a park bench overlooking the water, Sarah sat down and took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. For so long, she had carried everything alone, fighting battles silently while feeling like an imposter in her own life. But now there was hope, a glimmer shining through the clouds that had hung over her for too long. In that moment of clarity amidst laughter with Mia by her side, the weight began to shift ever so slightly off her shoulders, a reminder that healing was possible if she took those first steps toward connection instead of isolation. As they watched ducks glide across the surface of the water under the warm afternoon sun, Sarah felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle within her, a promise that perhaps tomorrow would be brighter than today if only she allowed herself to believe it once more. Chapter 7. Reaching Out. The following week unfolded slowly, each day a blend of reflection and newfound determination. Sarah spent her mornings in quiet contemplation, journaling her thoughts and feelings as she began to process the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed her for so long. The act of writing felt liberating, a way to untangle the knots in her mind. After a few days of rest, she finally gathered the courage to look into support groups for healthcare workers. With Mia's encouragement still fresh in her mind, Sarah found a local group that met weekly at a community center not far from her apartment. As the day of the meeting approached, anxiety bubbled within her. What if she didn't fit in? What if she couldn't share her story? But deep down, she knew that this was a necessary step toward healing. On the evening of the meeting, Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair and taking deep breaths. She wore a simple but comfortable outfit, a soft sweater and jeans, and tried to quell the storm of nerves swirling in her stomach. "Just be yourself," she whispered to her reflection before grabbing her bag and heading out the door. The community center was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and cheerful decorations. As she entered the room where the support group was held, Sarah felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. A circle of chairs was set up in the center, and several people were already seated, some chatting quietly while others looked lost in thought. "Hi there." A friendly voice broke through her hesitation. A woman with curly hair and an easy smile approached Sarah. "You must be new." "I'm Lisa." "Hi, I'm Sarah," she replied, feeling a little more at ease. "Welcome. We're glad you're here," Lisa said warmly. "Feel free to grab a seat anywhere." Sarah nodded and chose a chair near the back of the circle. As more people trickled in, she observed them, nurses, paramedics, and doctors, all wearing expressions that mirrored her own feelings of exhaustion and vulnerability. Once everyone was settled, Lisa introduced herself as the facilitator for the group. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a safe space where we can share our experiences and support one another." As Lisa spoke about the importance of connection and understanding within their profession, Sarah felt herself relax slightly. It was comforting to know that everyone in this room shared similar struggles. After some initial icebreakers, Lisa invited anyone who felt comfortable to share their story. The first person to speak was a nurse named Tom who worked in the ER. He shared his experience with burnout after losing several patients in quick succession during a particularly busy month. "I thought I could handle it all," Tom admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I realized I needed help when I started feeling numb to everything around me." As he spoke, Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. His story resonated deeply with her own struggles, the weight of responsibility that had become unbearable. One by one, others shared their experiences, stories filled with heartache, loss, and resilience. Each person's vulnerability peeled back layers of isolation that Sarah had carried for so long. When it was finally Sarah's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and began to share her own journey. The pressures of nursing, her bond with Mrs. Jenkins, and how she had pushed everyone away out of fear and pride. "I just felt like I had to be strong all the time," she said softly as tears streamed down her cheeks. "But I realized that strength isn't just about carrying everything alone, it's also about allowing others to help you." The group listened intently as she spoke, nodding in understanding. When she finished sharing, there was a moment of silence before Lisa offered words of encouragement. "Thank you for sharing that with us, Sarah," Lisa said gently. "It takes courage to open up about our struggles." As others chimed in with supportive comments, offering advice or simply expressing empathy, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. In this room filled with strangers who understood her pain, she felt seen for the first time in months. After the meeting concluded, several members approached Sarah to offer their support and exchange contact information. She left feeling lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued attending the support group regularly. Each meeting brought new insights and connections that helped her navigate through her feelings of burnout and isolation. She began practicing self-care more intentionally, taking walks along the waterfront, journaling regularly, and even trying yoga classes with Mia on weekends. The small changes began to add up. Slowly but surely, she started feeling more like herself again. One evening after a particularly uplifting support group session where they discussed coping strategies for stress management, Sarah decided it was time to check on Mrs. Jenkins again. Arriving at St. Jude's Hospital felt different this time. Instead of dread or anxiety swirling within her, there was anticipation mixed with hope. As she walked through the familiar corridors toward Mrs. Jenkins' room, she felt empowered by all that she had learned from both the group and herself. When she entered Mrs. Jenkins' room, the elderly woman looked up from her bed with surprise and delight lighting up her face. "Sarah! What a lovely surprise!" Mrs. Jenkins exclaimed as if sunshine had just entered the room. "Hi. I've missed you," Sarah said genuinely as she approached the bed. "I've missed you too. How have you been?" Mrs. Jenkins asked with genuine interest. "I've been working on taking care of myself," Sarah replied honestly as she sat down beside Mrs. Jenkins' bed. "I even joined a support group for healthcare workers." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes sparkled with approval as she nodded encouragingly. "That sounds wonderful. You deserve all the help you can get." As they talked about life, sharing laughter over stories both old and new, Sarah realized how much this connection meant to both of them. In that moment together, two women from different walks of life connected by shared experiences, Sarah felt hope blooming within her once more, a reminder that even amidst life's challenges, reaching out could lead to healing not just for herself but also for those around her who cared deeply for one another's well-being. And perhaps most importantly, She learned that it was okay to lean on others when times got tough, a lesson that would carry forward into every aspect of her life moving forward from here on out as they navigated this journey together hand in hand through whatever came next. Chapter 8. Embracing Change. The weeks rolled on, each one a little brighter than the last as Sarah settled into her new routine. The support group had become a lifeline, a space where she could share her struggles and victories with others who truly understood. Each meeting left her feeling lighter, more empowered, and increasingly connected to her colleagues in ways she had never experienced before. One sunny afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in a small cafe with Mia, sipping herbal tea and discussing their plans for the upcoming weekend. The cafe was bustling with life, people chatting, laughter ringing out, and the aroma of freshly baked pastries wafting through the air. "I can't believe you're actually going to do it," Mia said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're really going to lead a wellness workshop for the nurses at St. Jude's?" "I know it sounds crazy," Sarah replied, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. "But I think it's important. We all need to talk about self-care and mental health, especially in our line of work." "It's not crazy at all. It's brilliant," Mia encouraged. "You've been through so much, and you have so much wisdom to share." Sarah smiled at her friend's enthusiasm but couldn't shake the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. What if no one shows up? What if I can't help them? "Just remember why you're doing this," Mia said gently. "You're not just sharing information, you're creating a space for people to feel seen and heard." That's powerful. With Mia's encouragement echoing in her mind, Sarah spent the next few days preparing for the workshop. She crafted an outline that included topics on stress management, the importance of taking breaks, and strategies for emotional resilience. She also planned interactive activities that would allow participants to share their experiences and support one another. When the day of the workshop arrived, Sarah felt a whirlwind of emotions. Excitement mingled with nerves as she walked through the hospital corridors toward the conference room. She arrived early to set up, arranging chairs in a circle and placing materials on a table at the front. As nurses began to trickle in, Sarah's heart raced. Would they find value in what she had to say? Would they be willing to open up? "Hey, I'm so glad you're here." Lisa greeted her as she entered the room, followed by a few other familiar faces from the support group. "Thanks for coming," Sarah replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. One by one, more nurses filled the room until it was nearly full. Sarah stood at the front, her palms slightly sweaty as she looked out at the sea of faces, some eager, some apprehensive. "Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me today," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm really excited to talk about something that affects all of us, self-care and mental health in our profession." As she launched into her presentation, sharing personal anecdotes and insights from her own journey toward healing, she felt the initial tension begin to fade. The room was filled with nods of agreement and murmurs of understanding as she spoke about burnout and the importance of reaching out for help. After presenting key concepts and strategies for managing stress, Sarah opened the floor for discussion. "I'd love to hear your thoughts or any experiences you'd like to share," she encouraged. To her surprise, hands shot up around the room as nurses eagerly shared their own stories, moments of vulnerability that resonated deeply within everyone present. Tom spoke about his struggles after losing a patient he had grown close to during treatment. "I felt like I was drowning in grief," he admitted, "but talking about it helped me find my footing again." A nurse named Rachel shared how she had taken up painting as an outlet for stress relief. "It's been therapeutic," she said with a smile. "I never thought I could create something beautiful until I tried." As stories flowed freely among colleagues who once felt isolated in their struggles, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of connection forming within the room, a reminder that they were all in this together. At one point during the discussion, Lisa leaned forward with curiosity. "Sarah, how did you find the courage to start this workshop?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah reflected on her journey, the moments of darkness that had led her here. "Honestly, it took hitting rock bottom before I realized how important it is to lean on others," she confessed. "I realized that strength isn't just about carrying everything alone, it's also about allowing ourselves to be vulnerable." The room fell silent for a moment before Lisa spoke again. "Thank you for being brave enough to share that." As they continued sharing stories and strategies throughout the afternoon, laughter mingling with tears, Sarah felt an incredible sense of purpose wash over her. This was what she had longed for: connection, understanding, and community among those who shared similar experiences. By the time they wrapped up the workshop with closing remarks and gratitude exchanged all around, the atmosphere was charged with positivity and hope. "Thank you all for being here today," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "Remember that taking care of yourselves is just as important as taking care of your patients." As everyone filed out of the room with smiles on their faces, a tangible sense of camaraderie lingering in the air, Sarah felt an overwhelming surge of joy flood through her heart. In that moment, she realized how far she had come, from feeling isolated and overwhelmed to standing confidently among colleagues who understood her journey. As she packed up materials from the workshop, her heart swelling with pride, Sarah knew this was only the beginning of something beautiful. A movement toward healing not just within herself, but also within those around her who were ready to embrace change together, moving forward into brighter days ahead filled with hope and resilience against whatever challenges lay ahead on their paths as caregivers united by purpose above all else through thick or thin alike, no matter what came next. Chapter 9. Leading by Example. The weeks following the wellness workshop felt transformative for Sarah. The connections she had forged with her colleagues deepened, and she found herself more engaged at work than ever before. The support group had become a regular part of her life, and she looked forward to each meeting, where they continued to share experiences and strategies for coping with the demands of their profession. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing her shift at St. Jude's Hospital, she received a message from Mia. *Hey, I heard from Lisa that the workshop went incredibly well. You should be so proud. A smile spread across Sarah's face as she replied, "Thanks. It felt amazing to connect with everyone. I think we really needed it." As she walked through the hospital corridors, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. She no longer felt like an imposter in her role as a nurse. Instead, she embraced her position as a leader among her peers. Inspired by the success of the workshop, she began brainstorming ideas for future sessions, topics that would continue to foster community and support within their demanding field. The following week, Sarah proposed a series of monthly wellness workshops to the hospital administration, emphasizing the importance of mental health and self-care for healthcare workers. To her delight, they agreed to support her initiative, providing resources and space for future gatherings. As word spread about the upcoming workshops, enthusiasm bubbled among the staff. Nurses from various departments expressed interest in participating, eager to engage in discussions about coping strategies and emotional resilience. On the day of the next workshop, Sarah arrived early to set up the room. She arranged chairs in a circle, prepared handouts on stress management techniques, and set out refreshments, a small but thoughtful touch that made the space feel welcoming. When participants began to arrive, Sarah greeted each one with warmth and excitement. The atmosphere buzzed with energy as nurses exchanged stories and laughter before settling into their seats. "Welcome back, everyone," Sarah said as she stood at the front of the room. "I'm so glad you're here today. Our focus will be on building resilience, how we can support ourselves and each other through challenging times." As she launched into her presentation, sharing insights from her own journey and encouraging participants to reflect on their experiences, Sarah felt a sense of purpose wash over her. This was what she had been meant to do: create a safe space for others to share their struggles and triumphs. After discussing various techniques for managing stress, like mindfulness exercises and journaling, Sarah opened the floor for discussion. "I'd love to hear your thoughts or any strategies you found helpful," she encouraged. One nurse named Jenna spoke up first. "I started practicing gratitude journaling," she said with enthusiasm. "Every night before bed, I write down 3 things I'm grateful for. It helps me shift my mindset." "That's wonderful," Sarah replied, feeling inspired by Jenna's insight. Another nurse chimed in with a suggestion about incorporating short breaks during shifts to recharge mentally. "Even just stepping outside for a few minutes can make a huge difference," he said. As ideas flowed freely among colleagues who once felt isolated in their struggles, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of connection forming within the room, a reminder that they were all in this together. Toward the end of the session, Sarah encouraged everyone to pair up and share their own experiences with self-care practices. As they engaged in meaningful conversations, laughter echoed through the room, a testament to the healing power of connection. When it was time to wrap up, Sarah stood at the front once more and smiled at everyone gathered before her. "Thank you all for being so open today," she said sincerely. "Remember that we're stronger together. Supporting one another is key to our resilience." As participants left the room with smiles on their faces, exchanging contact information and promising to meet again soon, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment wash over her. In that moment of connection and shared understanding, two women from different walks of life connected by shared experiences, Sarah realized how far she had come, not just in her personal journey, but also in creating a community that prioritized mental health and well-being among caregivers. As she packed up materials from the workshop, her heart swelling with pride, Sarah knew this was only the beginning of something beautiful, a movement toward healing not just within herself, but also within those around her who were ready to embrace change together, moving forward into brighter days ahead filled with hope and resilience against whatever challenges lay ahead on their paths as caregivers united by purpose above all else through thick or thin alike, no matter what came next. With renewed energy coursing through her veins after another successful workshop behind them all, the next chapter awaited them all filled with promise, a reminder that even amidst life's challenges, reaching out could lead to healing not just for themselves, but also for those around them who cared deeply for one another's well-being as they navigated this journey together hand in hand through whatever came next. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The sun shone brightly over Portland as Sarah stepped out of St. Jude's Hospital, a sense of lightness enveloping her. The air was crisp, and the vibrant fall colors painted the landscape in hues of orange and gold. It felt like the city itself was celebrating her transformation, a new beginning that had blossomed from a season of struggle. Over the past few months, Sarah had embraced her role as a leader among her colleagues, fostering a supportive community that prioritized mental health and self-care. The monthly wellness workshops had become a staple for many nurses at St. Jude's, with attendance steadily growing as more staff recognized the importance of sharing their experiences. As she walked through the hospital parking lot, Sarah reflected on how far she had come since that fateful day when she had collapsed from exhaustion. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. She no longer felt like an imposter. Instead, she embraced her vulnerability and allowed herself to lean on others. That evening, Sarah was hosting a small gathering at her apartment to celebrate the success of the workshops and to thank her friends for their unwavering support. Mia was already there, helping set up snacks and drinks. "Everything looks amazing," Sarah said as she entered her living room, which was adorned with twinkling fairy lights and cozy seating. "Thanks. I thought we could create a warm atmosphere," Mia replied with a grin. "Everyone is excited to celebrate." As guests began to arrive, nurses from various departments and members of the support group, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Each person who walked through the door represented a connection forged through shared experiences, laughter, and healing. "Hey, Sarah," Tom called out as he entered with a plate of cookies. "I brought treats." "Perfect. Thank you," she replied, feeling her heart swell with appreciation for the camaraderie that had developed among them all. As the evening unfolded, laughter filled the air as stories were shared about their experiences in nursing, the challenges they faced, and the victories they celebrated. Sarah watched as colleagues who once felt isolated connected over their shared struggles. It was a beautiful reminder of how far they had all come together. "Sarah," Lisa said during a lull in conversation, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. These workshops have made such a difference for so many of us." "Absolutely," Jenna chimed in. "I never realized how important it was to talk about our feelings until I started coming to these sessions." Sarah felt warmth spread through her heart at their words. "Thank you all for being so open and willing to share your stories," she said sincerely. "It's been an incredible journey for me too." As the night wore on, they played games and enjoyed each other's company, an atmosphere filled with joy and connection that felt like a balm for their souls. At one point during the evening, Sarah stepped outside onto her balcony to catch her breath. The cool night air felt refreshing against her skin as she gazed out at the city lights twinkling below. Mia joined her moments later, leaning against the railing beside her. "You did it," she said softly. "You created something beautiful here." "I couldn't have done it without you," Sarah replied gratefully. Your support has meant everything to me." Mia smiled knowingly. "We all need each other more than we realize." As they stood together in comfortable silence, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in such a short time, not just within herself, but also within her community of nurses who had come together to support one another through life's challenges. Later in the evening, as guests began to leave, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment settle within her, a realization that this was just the beginning of something greater. As she hugged each friend goodbye, expressing gratitude for their presence in her life, she knew that they would continue to support one another moving forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. When Mia was finally ready to leave, she turned to Sarah with a smile. "You've come so far, my friend. I'm proud of you." "Thank you," Sarah said sincerely. "I'm proud of us all." As Mia headed out into the night, Sarah closed the door behind her and took a moment to absorb everything that had transpired, the growth, the connections forged, and the resilience discovered within herself and others. With renewed energy coursing through her veins after another successful gathering filled with laughter and love, the next chapter awaited them, all filled with promise, a reminder that even amidst life's challenges, reaching out could lead to healing not just for themselves, but also for those around them who cared deeply for one another's well-being as they navigated this journey together hand in hand through whatever came next. As she turned off the lights and settled onto her couch, surrounded by remnants of joy from the evening, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of hope wash over her, a promise that tomorrow would be brighter than today if only she continued to embrace vulnerability and connection moving forward into this new beginning filled with endless possibilities ahead.